Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb dialogue with the legendary David Cay Johnston. We are recording on April 22nd at approximately 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it is my honor, David, to connect with you one-on-one. We've had a couple of recordings in the past with, of course, the great William K. Black and June Carbone, whom you are colleagues with. But as we get started, I just want to do a little bit of a brief introduction because if I read your entire introduction, it'd take up half of our time because it is so prolific. But I love introducing the title of your books, of which you've written many over the course of your prolific career, starting with Temples of Chance, How America Incorporated Bought Out Murder Incorporated to Win Control of the Casino Business. What an amazing title. Perfectly Legal, the covert campaign to rig our tax system to benefit the super rich and cheat everybody else. Unbelievable title. Free Lunch, how the wealthiest Americans enrich themselves at government's expense and stick you with the bill. Wow, am I seeing a pattern there? And The Fine Print, how big company used plain English to rob you blind, divided the perils of our growing inequality, which is a huge subject of everything that you've put forth throughout your career. But what most everyone knows you about is, of course, you being, I think, what I've heard you say on occasion, Donald Trump's most hated journalist, beginning with titles such as The Making of Donald Trump that you wrote in 2016. It's even worse than you think, what the Trump administration is doing to America. And then other incredible books like The Big Cheat, How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. And before we move on to the next phase, I'm just going to read your bio that you wrote yourself on LinkedIn, which I think is really cool, but I think it's neat because it's coming from your point of view. But you write, you're a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter, best-selling author of 8 books, professor of practice at Rochester Institute of Technology. You were the chief editor at DC Report and an investigative reporter and editor, board president. And this is absolutely huge. A husband and father of 8, which is, I don't know how you had time to do that. In between everything else, from starting off at the San Jose Mercury, which is an incredibly important newspaper in our country's history. Of course, the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, and then you went on to DC Reports. So, David, we are really at sort of this moment in your career where you've been telling us everything that was going to happen. Now, I think you might have been surprised by a few things here and there, but starting off between all things the last 2 months of Doge, obviously the kidnapping and lack of habeas corpus and throwing out the rule of law and thumbing his nose at the Supreme Court and everything else. I guess the first question I would ask to you at the moment is, you kind of wake up every single day thinking it's like a nightmare Groundhog Day.
Oh, that's how I describe Donald's life. It's the story of Groundhog Day, not the comedy, but the nightmare. The summer Donald turned 13, his father sent him off to a military academy, which no longer exists here in New York State. This academy was well known, like many such schools, for hazing young recruits and, in particular, sexually humiliating them.
Wow.
And if you listen to how Donald talks about women, and Donald's 79 years old come June, he talks about them like a 13 or 14-year-old boy. And that's because emotionally he's been trapped in that year of puberty. We all went through one at least terrible year, usually in junior high school years, and then we grow out of it. But Donald never got past it emotionally. And so much of his behavior you can understand. And the audience should know I've been covering Donald since 1988. In fact, that year I wrote about the prospect of him becoming president of the United States, which I thought would be horrible. But I realized that he is by far the most talented con artist I have ever covered. And I've covered lots of con artists in my career, gotten some of them prosecuted and sent to prison. Donald should have been prosecuted many times and sent to prison long ago, but he also mastered, thanks to the advice of his, as he calls him, second father, the notorious McCarthy era lawyer Roy Cohn, how to evade law enforcement. The first thing you do is attack them. You know, the police, the courts, whoever it is, they're all corrupt. You're absolutely pure and honest, and they're corrupt. Second, you never, ever give an inch. You don't acknowledge a comma as an error. And then third, delay, delay, delay. And Donald's been very good at all of those, and it's why he isn't where he belongs, which is in a prison.
Oh, well, that and then also the failure, as we both know, of our legal system to rein in difficult prosecutions. But by your writings, I mean, it seems to me like, oh man, going back to the beginning, especially in the casino business, as I, prefaced before, when Donald got into Atlantic City, can you comment really about that early sort of understanding of his business practices and what it led
Sure.
you to understand, particularly as it related to, as I recall, falsification of business records and also being involved with some questionable characters?
Well, I had been at the LA Times and I left it to go to be the Atlantic City bureau chief for the Philadelphia Inquirer, partly because I believed that under a 1987 Supreme Court decision that some Native Americans have the right to casinos, that we would see casinos spread all across the country. The LA Times editors were like, "What? How can you possibly know that?" And I said, "Well, if you understand the law and the economics of things, I can't tell you exactly what will happen. I can tell you the general trend of where things will go." So, um, uh, one of the first things I did was read The Art of the Deal. And that book is a serial description of just one fraud and con after another. My favorite story in it is about how he hadn't done any work to build the first casino in partnership with the company that owned the Holiday Inn chain of hotels and the Harrah's casinos. So on the day the board of directors came to Atlantic City to meet, he hired crews to dig holes at one end of the property and move the dirt to the other end and then move it back. Only one director realized what he was doing. And Donald brags about how he basically talked past the guy and got him to drop it.
Hmm.
But it was indicative of who he is. And then the first time we had a serious conversation, which was in early June of 1988, I had spent a lot of time preparing for it. He was the only really interesting casino executive. The rest of them were all suits. And his own guys and some of the regulators were telling me, and his competitors, that he was a complete fraud. He didn't know anything about the gambling business. And I was like, oh, come on, he owns two casinos. How can he not know anything about the business? Well, turned out he didn't literally know anything about the business. So I wrote down four questions in my notebook, and each of them was false in its foundation, in its premise. And Donald ran with them. And years later, he did this with uh, uh, the host on the anchor for the NBC nightly news, Lester Holt. And I realized, oh my goodness, he's a con artist. He's like the ads that were running on TV. Hi, is your boyfriend going to leave you? Is your husband cheating on you? Well, call California Psychics. We're the real psychics. We can tell you the truth. And the trick to that is, you make assumptions and then go where you think the person you're talking to wants to go. And that works with most people. It doesn't work with investigative reporters. It does work with this astonishing number of journalists who are gullible. And Donald, in all four questions, simply assumed the question I asked was true and then ran with it and shaped a story he thought I would like. And that was the moment I realized that he creates his own reality. Now, Donald is not the only person in public life that I've written about, and my career stretches back to 1966 when I was still in high school and writing for first one and then a second weekly shopper newspaper. And then I got hired at the San Jose Mercury as a staff writer when I was 19, and I made the front page within a matter of weeks. Um, the lesson that I learned from that meeting with Donald was that it's all a fraud. Everything is a fraud, and people aren't questioning him. There are lots of journalists who don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And Donald was used to telling tall tales, would be the polite way to put it, and people running with them, especially when he could pit the two New York tabloids against each other, the New York Daily News and the New York Post. And once he got a story in either one of them, then it was legitimate for some other news organization like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal to pick it up. And the only people critically examining him at the time were um, my very good and late friend Wayne Barrett of the Village Voice, who was the first person to get onto Donald. Um, uh, Neil Barsky at the Wall Street Journal, who then went on to work in the hedge fund business and make a fortune and now subsidizes things like the Marshall Project on Criminal Justice and the Columbia Journalism Review. A little, as much as he was allowed by his paper, Dan Hennigan at the Atlantic City Press, he was pretty hemmed in, but I thought he did a good job considering the circumstances, and me. And everybody else would just, whatever Donald said, they would run with it. I had a reporter from the Newark Star Ledger, tell me once, that it was just too much work to check what Donald said. And and he was, he's a good story. But so he got away with this nonsense. I'm one of the biggest developers in New York. No, you're not. You weren't ever even in the top 10. Um, I only hire the best. Yeah, right. You hired 400 illegal aliens and then refused to pay them until they were living in the Bonwit Teller department store, which is what was on the site of Trump Tower. In the middle of winter, they're living in the building. They're taking it apart by hand with sledgehammers, not the way you normally decommission a building in New York. And he refuses to pay them, so they can't even eat. And only when they took his overseer on the project and threatened to hang him off I think it was the ninth floor, did Donald pay up. And when they went to collect their cash wages, at the end of the table after they got their money was a mob guy, and they had to give a kickback to the mob guy. And Donald has always been mobbed up. His father had, and there's plenty of public record on this, a business partner named Willie Tomasello. Willie was a front for the Gambino and Genovese families in their various criminal enterprises. Donald puts out to people, well, you had to deal with the mob if you were in construction. Well, actually, in the 1970s, the Resnicks, the Lafracs, and the other actual big developers went to the Justice Department and said, this is getting too bad. You got to get these mobsters out of our pocket or we can't do any building in New York City. One developer ran the other direction into the arms of the mob, and that was Donald Trump. So when the concrete business totally mobbed up, there was a strike in the concrete business. Every project in New York stopped. You were having a new driveway poured? Nope, no truck shows up. One project got its concrete on time, and that was Trump Tower. And by the way, Trump Tower is not a traditional steel girder high-rise building. It's concrete, covered over with the glass. And so that Donald's was the only project that got its concrete, and he bought his concrete from something called A&S, which was owned by the leaders of the Gambino and Genovese families. There was a whole trial about it. They went to prison. It tells you how deeply Donald was in bed with the mob, but he was in bed with mobsters on everything. There was no reason for him to be involved with many other mobsters. And the most important example, and it's very important to those listening to know, everything I'm about to say, as is everything I write about Donald, I can prove from documents or videos of Donald or other irrefutable evidence. For years, Donald Trump was entangled up to his eyeballs with a guy named Joe Wexelbomb, a twice convicted felon and a mob front guy. Joe supplied Donald with his helicopters for his high roller casino customers. He also was the manager and often the pilot of Donald's Eurocopter, the Ivana, which he used to build up his image of himself. Joe Wexelbomb was one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in America. He got caught. He brought in cocaine and marijuana from Colombia to Miami, and then he had it put in cars and had it driven up to Ohio. Being a two-time convicted felon, when the DEA nailed him, Joe handwrote a confession, which I have. And a little later, a mysterious thing happened to him. His case was transferred from Cincinnati, Ohio, where everything took place, to Newark, New Jersey, to the courtroom of a newly appointed federal judge named Marianne Trump Berry, Donald's older sister. No crime was alleged to have happened there. And no one can explain how it went to New Jersey. It could have been transferred to Manhattan or to Miami for sentencing for the convenience of Mr. Wexelbomb. But there's no reason for it to go to Miami. Well, his sister, after 3 weeks, removes herself. It's called a recusal from the case. But she has to go down the hall to the chief judge. And imagine for a moment, Patrick, you're the chief federal judge for the state of New Jersey. And I come in as a newly appointed federal judge, and by the way, totally unqualified to be a judge. Political deal arranged by none other than Roy Cohn with the Reagan White House. And I say, hey, listen, I have a problem with this case. I'm going to have to recuse myself because I fly in this man's helicopters all the time. He's personally been the pilot many times when I fly in it. And my husband, who, or in my case, it would be my wife, who's a lawyer for Donald's casinos, flies in them weekly, going back and forth, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week to go down to Atlantic City. So I've got to recuse myself from this case. Your first thought's going to be, oh my God, I've got a federal judge who's being ferried around by a major confessed cocaine trafficker. I hope the news media doesn't ever find out about this. Well, 7 years later, Wayne Barrett proved it. And I wrote about it in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The state of New Jersey did an investigation. And as with all of their investigations, when it came to the owners, it was a see no evil, hear no evil investigation. They dismissed the significance of this. By the way, the mules who simply drove the drugs after Joe personally handled the drugs and helped load them into the cars. You know, the chairman of the board of ExxonMobil doesn't pump gasoline. He's in the gasoline business. And Joe actually did the equivalent of pumping gas. The mules who drove, all they did was drive the drugs. 20 years each in prison. Donald wrote a letter to the judge who took over the case. And in the letter, he called Joe Wexelbomb a stand-up guy, you know, a great American, a credit to his community, and said he shouldn't get any jail time at all. Now, as I read the letter, and you want to read it, I think you'll come to the same conclusion. What it says between the lines is, hey, Joe, keep your mouth shut and I will take care of you. Don't say anything about our business dealings. Well, Joe served 18 months, not 20 years, 18 months. To get out, he had to have work. Well, I have a job. I'm going to go back to working for Donald Trump as his helicopter guy. He was supposed to pay a $30,000 fine. He made 3 payments of $200 each, $600, and then said, I'm broke. I don't have any money. I can't pay. And the courts never went after him to pay. Guess where he moved when he got out of prison? This broke man moved into a multi-million-dollar double apartment in Trump Tower.
I was going to say Trump Tower. Wow.
Now, he didn't own it. His girlfriend owned it, effectively his wife.
Right.
And Donald took care of him in every possible way. Now, you understand that when I was in Los Angeles in the 80s and I was investigating the LAPD, I was the first journalist to seriously investigate the LAPD. It ruined my career at the LA Times because they did not want to tell the truth about the LAPD was not the most efficient, effective, honest, world-class police department in the world. Daryl Gates, the police chief, was always telling me there were a whole bunch of leading businessmen, brand name businessmen in town who were involved in financing the cocaine business. And he and I talked about this, half a dozen times. And I kept saying, when you got the case, man, we will be all over that. Just don't dump it on us. Make sure that when you're ready to go, you need to put me with a bunch of cops so I can't get access to a phone or something, that's fine. But make sure that, we've got this and we will make a big deal out of it. Of course, the only case that was ever brought was John DeLorean by the feds. And a jury just couldn't believe that someone like DeLorean would be in the cocaine business because, people tend to worship those that they see as being celebrities or famous or same thing with Wesley Snipes and his tax cheating. So Donald has spent his entire life dealing with criminals. When he built Trump Tower, the first units went up for sale at the end of 1983, November and December. And he doesn't own most of the building anymore. They sold most of the units in the building. He retained some, the retail space, office space, and some of the apartments. Uh, he didn't ask questions about who you were. Now, when my wife and I bought a tiny studio apartment in Manhattan for me to stay in when I was in New York working for the New York Times, I would fly down and spend the week there if I wasn't on the road elsewhere. We had to go before a co op board. We had to prove our bona fides. We had to prove we were nice and acceptable and weren't going to be troublesome. But you could buy into Trump Tower with no background check. Donald didn't care. And as a result, he charged enormously higher than market level prices. Because if you're a mobster, you can't get into any nice building in New York except Trump Tower and Olympia Tower, owned by the family that the widow Jackie Kennedy married into, the Onassis family. And that building is seen as a viper's nest by the New York Police Department's Organized Crime Bureau, the FBI's organized crime guys, Interpol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just full of people who are serious heavyweight criminals. In one case, a Russian bought 5 apartments from Donald, and he showed up. Donald went to the closing personally. When the guy showed up, he brought cash. And I don't mean he brought a check, I mean he brought cash, greenbacks, to pay for 5 apartments early in, it was either late 1983 or early 1984. And Donald has been courted by the Kremlin since 1987, when they gave him an all expenses paid trip to Russia. And we went to St. Petersburg and other places. Now, all governments, including our government, try and make assets out of people who we think can be valuable to them. That's part of spycraft. Donald is so easy to flatter and lacking in guile on some areas that I don't think he realized what the Russians were doing, the old communist Russians. And of course, Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB officer, so he's skilled in spycraft, who has said that the worst tragedy of the 20th century, wasn't the Holocaust, it wasn't the Pol Pot's murdering 25% of his country's population, it was the breakup of the old Soviet Union, which he wants to put back together. And Donald has been relying on the Russians for forever. Now, he is clearly an asset of the Kremlin. You can be an unwitting asset, but he's an asset. And how do we know that? Well, in 2018 in Helsinki, he met alone with Vladimir Putin. There were no Americans in the meeting. We don't know what other Russians were in the meeting, but he had a translator in one of the meetings, and he took her notes and had them torn up, which is arguably a criminal offense. But normally when a president of the United States meets with any other head of state, there's a whole bunch of people with them to make sure that everybody knows what was said. Somebody takes very careful notes. Somebody else takes very careful notes as well. They make sure that U.S. national security isn't compromised in any way. Donald had at least had the meeting with the note taker whose notes he destroyed. Then he had a meeting with nobody there that lasted hours. And he said in Helsinki in public, I don't trust any of the U.S. national security agencies. There are 17 of them. But I take Vladimir Putin at his word. He's a good man. And ever since then, try and find a critical word about Vladimir Putin. Only in the last few weeks, when Trump has utterly failed in his promise that in one day he would bring an end to the invasion, the aggressive war by Russia against Ukraine, has he said anything that even borders on being critical. And so Donald has managed to get most people to believe it's a Russia hoax. It's all a hoax. No, it's not. If you actually sat down and read the 408-page Mueller report, and assuming you have some knowledge of the law, you would realize that it is a story of crime after crime after crime. There are, by my count, 10 crimes identified. Other people have found a few more than that. Other people argue a few less. But when I read it, I marked off 10 crimes, primarily obstruction of justice and lying to federal agents. So ever since I met Donald, to wrap this up, in 1988, I understood he was a colorful character. What I learned the first time we talked was he's a con artist and that he creates his own reality. Timothy Snyder, the Yale professor who's moving to Toronto because of Trump to the University of Toronto, uses a slightly different phrase. He came along many years after me. He says, Donald lives in a fictional world in his head, and that's why he can just rewrite the narrative whenever he needs to. But Donald you got to admire his skill as a con artist. I mean, he has conned himself into the White House. He is utterly ignorant. This is a man who had to be told why there is a memorial over the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. How can you grow up in America and not know a date that will live in infamy, December 7, 1941? He thought Finland was an oblast, that's like a state or a province of Russia. He thought Frederick Douglass, who died in 1895, was getting more and more popular every day. He's alive. He doesn't know anything. And when I was investigating Donald, I tried to find fellow students from Penn, uh, where he studied. He'll tell you he studied at the Wharton School. He didn't. He was in the undergraduate part of Wharton. He was studying real estate, which had one professor. He got credit for working on an apartment building project of his father's in Cincinnati. And I tried to find women he'd gone out on dates with. I did that in Manhattan too. And the most common word used to describe him by women who, and remember, young women, there are always lots of young women looking for a tall, reasonably good looking, as he was when he was young, rich guy, right? Yeah. The most common word they used to describe him was creep. And he tells everybody I was an honor student. Well, if you're an honor student, there's records of that. There's no records of that. And he almost never was on campus. His daddy simply made a financial arrangement to make sure he didn't go to Vietnam. And Donald's whole life has been a tissue of lies that aren't even that difficult to show are lies. But what I just told you all about Joe Wexelbomb and the cocaine trafficker, even though everything I've told you is in public records that are irrefutable, federal court records, handwritten confession, etc., not one word of that has ever appeared in my former newspaper, the New York Times. It's never appeared in the Washington Post. It's never appeared in the AP, Bloomberg. I got a brief mention of it once in Politico magazine. And of course, at DC Report, we've written about it. How can that not be touched? It's just beyond belief. I mean, the New York Times sent a reporter named Janie Scott to Indonesia to find Barack Obama's kindergarten play pals. She went to Hawaii and she found the high school classmates who smoked marijuana with Barack Obama. That's worthy of investigating, but not Donald Trump's being involved up to his eyeballs. And there are many, many other criminals. There's a mobbed up major multi-location car dealer in Long Island he did business with that's all in the public record, and Donald bragged about it. He was involved with Adnan Khashoggi, the infamous arms dealer. He had a violent felon named Felix Sater working for him. He said when the issue came up, I don't think I know. I guess I've met him. I wouldn't recognize him if we're in the same room. They flew together on his Boeing 757 all over the country. There's video of them laughing together. And Felix Sater managed to get out of prison in a huge stock scam because he said he could intercept terrorist weaponry. And he did. Now, the Justice Department has vouched for him having done this. Now, of course, when they got the 100 or so weapons they were after, how do we know there weren't 200 and Felix took the rest and sold them? We don't know that. I don't know that either. I'm just pointing out that the relationship was such. But wait a second. Donald Trump was one step away from terrorists getting missiles. One step, Felix Sater. Excuse me? And Felix Sater is, of course, a Russian-born American whose father is a notorious Russian mobster. So the problem is even people who don't like Donald Trump, Patrick, they don't know this stuff. I can tell from the way you're smiling. A lot of this is new to you, and I just it's a terrible failing of news organizations and also of the people who ran against him. I mean, why wasn't Hillary Clinton doing this? Why in the debate didn't she say, "Well, tell us all about the years you spent in partnership with one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in America, Joe Wexelbomb. Tell us about the 12-year-old children you plied with liquor and limousines and hotel rooms because they had money to gamble." I don't understand this utter failure of both news organizations and politicians to bring this stuff up.
I have my own sort of relationship with that, and but yes, my God, all of it makes so much sense, and I knew some of it obviously from previous dialogue and watching your interviews throughout time and reading a lot of your stuff. But it's such a panoply that spreads decades, and to hear you say it so succinctly and so connected, and so, I mean, it's just the clarity is unbelievable. But the question is, what is going to sear in my brain for the next, I don't know, however long until we resolve this, because you're that conduit. And I have to ask you from this perspective, because I experienced this all over the 50, 501 protests recently that have been
Yeah,
all over the United States, right? And we're seeing these brilliantly provoking signs with incredible thought, and there's not a lot of space to say what's being said on these signs, and when you look at them in this cacophony, it's like the symphony of what you're saying. These signs are begging for the truth. Now, one of the speakers that I happen to witness directly, and this is kind of the disconnect between the younger generations, quite frankly, that are more active, of course, and being out in the streets. This one young woman gets up on the microphone and she starts uh, going on about the notion of there is no truth, that it's subjective, that we all learn, and this is because, and this is why I wanted to set this up for
yeah,
who you are and what you've done for the last, I don't know, your entire career, quite frankly. I kept thinking to myself, this poor young woman has grown up in a time period where everything is so fractured because of social media, because mainstream media hasn't done its job, that we don't have the types of directors that I grew up with. When you were describing this whole thing, I'm like, I just thought I was watching The Godfather, for Christ's sakes, right? Among other things. And I come from that generation just slightly below that you influenced, that you and your colleagues had influenced, that gave me the power of the truth, especially as the fourth estate, to hold power to account. That's the entire notion of democracy. So I have to ask you first, David, considering everything you just rolled out, what are some of the influences that drove you to this commitment of muckraking of truth for the
sure.
people, and then also really, if you could just define the truth in your own words.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a very unusual household. My mother was an only child who was a disowned heiress to a Minnesota lumber baron. He had testified against her, she testified against her father in 1941 before Pearl Harbor, when he was sued by his mistress's husband for alienation of affection. You were to go into a lawyer's office today and say, "I want to sue this person having an affair with my spouse for alienation of affection," I suspect the lawyer would burst out laughing. But my grandfather had to pay $10,000, which in 1941 was a lot of money, about 8 years' income for the average family, or the median family. Um, and my father was a disabled World War II vet. And my parents raised us to have an understanding and respect for the other, for people who were less fortunate than us, uh, and to have regard for other people. So I had intended to become an LAPD homicide detective. That was my career goal. It's in my junior high school yearbook. Um, I got hired instead by the San Jose Mercury because these little shopper papers had hired me and my stories were getting attention. The NBC owned radio station in San Francisco, which dominated the market in 1967, read one of my stories on the air, my first investigative piece, which I went back and read. It's just terrible, but I was only 17 years old. Um, and kept saying, "Why isn't this in the San Francisco Chronicle?" So I got noticed. And so I simply, it turns out newspapering in the early years, at least, paid better than being a cop. And I really liked it. And I wouldn't have done well in a paramilitary organization. If you've watched the TV series Bosch, without some of the gratuitous brutality, I would have been a lot like him. At every newspaper I worked, what happened over time was they really wanted my work. I never applied for a job. My whole career, from the two weeklies, the San Jose Mercury, all the way to the Rochester Institute of Technology, people recruited me. The New York Times came to me. But they also were not happy with the way I do things, and eventually wear out the relationship. Um, it's interesting to do this, to find out things people don't know, right wrongs. I've solved murders. I've gotten lots of people sent to prison as tax cheats. I've saved taxpayers what Congress valued at hundreds of billions of dollars in just the first 10 years. Exposed corruption at two of the biggest foundations in America and the three biggest United Ways, and a lot of other stuff. And Donald has always presented to me as a case of someone who managed to understand the conventions of the news business and to use them to his advantage. Baron Hilton, who died recently, who was trying to steal 2/3 of $1 billion from the poor children of the earth. In the long run, they were better off for what he did, but at the time, nobody knew that. I followed him for years. Daryl Gates, the megalomaniac, spy on everybody. I'm Jeremiah the prophet saving the world from corruption, police chief in LA. Jack Welch, the absolute fraud of a CEO, who I think everybody now realizes he ruined General Electric, and Donald Trump. And so I kept files on these people all this time. It's important to understand that prior to the 1960s, there really was very little investigative reporting in the country. There was, from time to time, big projects that were done, but it's not like today where we have an organization, investigative reporters and editors, of which I've been the president in the past, with thousands of members, and we teach skills and how to do these things. So there was sort of a golden age from about the time I entered the business in the late 60s up until the economic model started to collapse in this century. That's unusual. It's not the norm. We benefited as a society, I believe, greatly from all of this, and we're being harmed by the loss of it and by the very shrunken news staffs. I mean, there are cities all across America with bigger than Rochester, where I live 5 blocks outside of Rochester, where there hasn't been a reporter covering a city council meeting in years because there's no staff left. The local Gannett newspaper, which was the flagship for many, many years of the Gannett chain, has gone from a newsroom staff of 226 to 24. 90% of the jobs are gone. And you therefore can't get the kind of coverage that a community really needs.
Can I insert something real quick?
Yeah.
Just to that point, because I've discovered, and this is going to be a point of pursuit for me for some time, but we saw all of the hedge funds and private equity take over media going back now the last 20 years. And now, most of us can see billionaires that, run the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times.
No. I'm going to stop you. That's not true. That is absolutely not true. Okay.
What part, the billionaires?
I'm really upset that people say that. Gannett, the biggest chain in the country, which used to have 600 papers and now has 300, run by a hedge fund. They care about nothing but money.
Right.
That's true. The LA Times, bought by a billionaire who started out doing great work, exposing the paper's history of racism, which I fought when I was a reporter there for 12 years, but now has turned into a Trumper, apparently. He's a billionaire who has other business interests. He's primarily a cancer doctor, right, who depends on the FDA approving his new drugs for his income. Jeff Bezos, he's a billionaire who bought the Washington Post entirely to learn more about retail, because he wants to go down in history as the person who changed retail. He never interfered in the newsroom. In fact, the interference he's done lately has only been in the editorial page. Yeah. That's his page. He can do any damn thing he wants with the editorial page. At the LA Times, they repeatedly ran editorials that essentially said, without naming me, you read this story on the front page a couple of days ago, don't believe it. That's fine. Publisher's entitled to do that as long as he publishes the news. The New York Times is owned by a family who we should all deeply respect. all the way through their ownership for roughly 130 years of that paper. They have taken far less in profits than they could. They have put far larger portion of their revenue into the newsroom budget. And while they make lots of mistakes, and I've complained about them and written about them, they are honorable people who are trying to do a good job. I mean, the fundamental problem with the New York Times is it's the establishment newspaper.
Okay.
The former executive editor Howell Raines said to the staff, "We are essentially the newsletter of the American elite who communicate to one another in all the different fields they're in, science, technology, law, finance, etc., through the pages of the New York Times." And I think that's very accurate. They haven't understood Donald, and they badly covered him. Mostly, I think, because they have a couple of people in the politics area who I think are in way over their heads. And instead of recognizing that and getting rid of them, they have kept them there. But they behave very honorably. The Associated Press is a non-profit cooperative. It's behaved very honorably. Bloomberg is owned by an enormous billionaire,
Right.
Michael Bloomberg. They have behaved very honorably. There have been news organizations that have been cowed. The best example is Disney owns ABC. Back in the beginning, it was the other way around.
Right.
ABC financed Disney creating Disneyland, and eventually the Disney company ended up owning ABC. And they bowed down to Donald, no question about it, in a terrible way. They gave $16 million to make him happy. There are big law firms that have bowed down. But there's lots of serious, terrific reporting. And I don't think most readers have a clue to how difficult the kind of reporting you have to do about Donald Trump is these days, because
You're gonna be sued.
nobody. Well, that's the least of the worries. Nobody is talking to you. The people who would normally
Oh,
be leaking aren't doing that.
sure.
The AP was literally thrown out of the White House until the court said you have to take them back, and they're still finding ways to minimize what the AP is doing because they call it the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America. I'm very troubled by all this disrespecting of what I think is a lot of good journalism. And listen, I've been writing journalism criticism for 52 years. I am the only journalist in American history whose work forced a broadcast chain, according to Forbes, the second most profitable broadcast chain in America, to shut down and go out of business after I proved they were manipulating news reports for the controlling owner's personal gain. I've been writing criticism my whole life and am well known for it in the field. And a lot of people don't like me because I'm don't hesitate to call out bad journalism, frauds, etc. I've written hundreds of articles over my career, but it's a tiny slice of what's wrong compared to the whole field of coverage. Now, the demonstrations you mentioned, the 5501s, a number of them suffered from a problem. If you don't have a leader, you don't have a Martin Luther King, for example, people go off on all sorts of tangents. So the demonstration here in Rochester drew at least 3,000 people, maybe more, depending on who you talk to. But one person got up who's running for mayor against the incumbent, who's a good manager. He's not a great leader, but he's a good guy and a good manager. What does that have to do with Donald Trump?
Right.
Somebody else got up to complain about the schools. Another group got up to complain that we have this terrible Spanish company that owns our electric system and is just raping our town.
Right.
None of that has anything to do with Donald. And so you need coherent, focused attention. I agree with you 100% that the signs that are showing up all across the country that were taken by photographers or
Yes.
friends and posted on social media show a great deal of creativity and brilliance.
And asking the questions.
Yeah. So fundamentally, Patrick, here's because I know we're running out of time here. What I think is we should pay attention to going forward. And I would only note that my track record on predictions about Donald is holding steady at 1,000. I've been correct every single time. You can be a star in baseball if you hit, what, 250? And I'm batting 1,000 after 10 years.
Well, yeah.
Number one, the courts have suddenly become very important, and hopefully Chief Justice of the United States, John Glover Roberts, recognizes that the 2023 immunity decision for the president, you can't review anything the president does, it's an official act, was a terrible mistake. Second, people need to understand this concept of the unitary executive pushed by John Yoo, Y-O-O, who's now a law professor, I believe, at UC Berkeley. is a license for corruption. The reason you want to have boards like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the advisory panels on drugs at the FDA, where you have to, when there's politics involved, have both parties represented, is it's a check on internal corruption. And so you need to be paying attention to the internal corruption. McDonald has fired at least 19 inspectors general and hasn't replaced some, and the others, when he replaces them, I'm sure will be toadies because he doesn't want to be held accountable. You need to pay a great deal of attention to how Wall Street is reacting to this. I mean, you could hate Wall Street all you want if that's your bent, but the reason that we are so wealthy and successful has to do with our financial standing in the world. If the European Union, the United Kingdom, which is no longer part of the EU, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe India were to form a new free trading zone, excluding the US, it's going to hurt us forever. We will never be where we could be from that happening. Donald is apparently planning to virtually close our State Department relations with Africa. Gosh, what are the Chinese doing in Africa? They're buying up land and water rights because they know the ocean's going to rise and Shanghai is going to be underwater in another 50, 100 years. There are minerals in Africa. There's huge potential for economic growth and development and trade. Donald doesn't like black people. He calls them, S-hole countries over there. Pay attention to what he's doing, less attention to what he says. Recognize that as time goes by, his utter incompetence as a manager. The reason he didn't do more in the first term is Donald is an utterly incompetent manager. That's why all his businesses go broke. This time he has a whole crew of not only zealots, but zealots with management skill, like Russell Vogt, who now runs the Office of Management and Budget, which is a little-known, unbelievably powerful agency that runs the financial strings on the executive side. Get a new Congress. In 2 years, Donald's going to try very hard to rig this election. So people need to be being vigilant about election rules. They need to get decent people on elected boards. Many, many places in this country, elections are run by an elected or appointed board. And the right-wing Republicans have been focused on that for decades. When it comes to be election time, get people registered to vote and then take some time off work and work on election day and the day before to get people to the polls. If you live in California, drive over to Arizona or Nevada and work with some organization like Move On or Indivisible or a campaign and bring a second person. You have to have two people in the car to do this. Drive people to the polls. We need to get a new Congress. And I don't mean we get a 10-seat majority in the House. I think that's almost certain to happen. We need to basically try to vote out every single Republican, even the ones who've been pretty good on issues, because of the discipline of the Trump people. The Senate was a very bad table for the Democrats last fall, better table for them in 2026. Need to get people elected. They are going to make more screw-ups between now and then. Social Security checks. People are going to not get their checks. They're going to call up, and that's not fraud, as Donald Trump's billionaire commerce secretary says. They need the money to live, and they're going to be told, "Oh yes, well we'll call you back when we have time." Well, when is that going to be? Well, we don't know. And it could be never. People need to really get on these things where he is ruining our government, which is what he promised to do in the first term. That's what my middle book in my Trump trilogy, It's Even Worse Than You Think, is about. He succeeded in some areas, especially damaging environmental protections. He utterly failed in others. He's just effectively killed worker safety inspections in this country. If you work in any blue collar field, you should be terrified about this because you can lose a hand or an arm or your life because they're not going to enforce the law. So stay focused on the mission, which is address Trump through the courts, get people who support Trump to realize that he's not their friend, he's their enemy, and focus heavily on flipping Congress, because if we can get the House and the Senate out of the hands of the Trumpers, the whole landscape changes.
Right. And that's if we get to have free and fair elections again. And I know you've addressed that and we don't have enough time to go into it, but I do want to just kind of close on this one. We got 5 minutes or 6 minutes.
Yep.
So, look, you are, again, self professed. Your focus has always been policy. It's not politics. And that's an important distinction
Right.
as people understand and they go into the descriptions and look into your books and so on and so forth. But this has been an amazing journey, especially the first half of this, dealing with the specifics of what created Trump. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, his background, his father, his grandfather that we've covered, and we can't go into that. But you are literally the most hated journalist in a profession that Donald Trump has deemed fake media because you've delivered the
Right.
truth, which are based on the facts and this incredible detailed of execution, particularly in policy as it relates to taxes. As we close out of here right now, I mean, look, just some closing comments about you are a window to over 4 decades of Donald Trump. And we are in a situation of which you have told us and warned us and gave us 1,000%. And now, given the fact that we got to turn Congress, if we have an opportunity, it's going to take millions of us focused on that outcome. Give us some closing thoughts, David.
Well, first of all, one of the things in America we have to recognize is we need to reduce our focus on blue collar or street crime, which has been falling for more than 100 years. I teach a criminal justice course, Law and Society, and white collar crime. That's what Donald is. He's the third generation head of a 4 generation white collar crime family. They don't kill people, they don't break their legs, but they lie, cheat, and steal with contracts and promises and using the courts. It costs about 20 times as much to society overall as street crime. So we really need to completely remake law enforcement, and people need to keep in mind white collar crime is rampant in this country and needs to be seriously addressed. We need to recognize that you don't have to agree with somebody to think they're honorable. So there's a story in the Times or the Washington Post that you read and you go, that person, what the hell? So they had a bad day. They screwed up. They got played, whatever. That doesn't make them the enemy. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, is the old saying. Be serious about what's going on. Grousing on Facebook and social media doesn't do anything. Everybody who cares knows. Do useful things. Be a citizen. Exercise your responsibilities, which include protesting and peaceably assembling to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Defend people you don't like when it comes to their free speech, their religion, their freedom of the press. It doesn't matter if you don't like them, you need to defend them, because if we all don't have due process of law, none of us have it. Recognize things are going to get worse before they get better. It's just the nature of how things work. All is not lost. That is the final, most important message. I keep seeing every day, and I get emails from people, there's no point to all of this, it's over. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. That's the path of cowards. You don't have to stand at the front of the line. You don't have to be in my position. Donald says he hates me more than any other journalist in the world. I think I've probably fallen down his list since he said that, given that I don't work in Washington and never have. But you can stand behind people who are standing up. There are senators like Sheldon Whitehouse and Chris Von Hollen. Stand behind those people. If you can afford to do so, contribute to campaigns, but don't scattershot. Pick some and focus on those. And engage people. When somebody who is a Trumper tells you, my Social Security check came this month, I didn't know what to do. Don't say, oh, well, we warned you. You want to say, that's terrible. I feel so much for you. What can we do to fix this? That is, engage in sympathy. And don't miss, there's a movement among the quote unquote Christians in this country. There are lots of real Christians. I'm talking about the faux Christians like Donald, preaching that empathy is a sin. You can go on the internet and read the sin of empathy. It's a shocking thing to see. Be empathetic to these people. They got played. They got played because for 50 years, their economics have been terrible. Those were the economics books, the best-selling economics books that you mentioned of mine, Free Lunch, The Fine Print, and most importantly, Perfectly Legal. Uh, they have real literal grievances. After I wrote my books about this massive upward distribution of money and did my back of the envelope spreadsheet analysis, the Rand Corporation started as a think tank for Boeing and the US Air Force 75 years ago, did a study, and they concluded that over almost 50 years, ending a few years ago, $50 trillion was uplifted to the top tenth of 1%. The whole US economy for a year is about $29 trillion. So essentially, almost 2 years of the entire economic output of the country was taken out of the pockets of everybody below the 99.9% and put into the hands of people at the top. And also, don't miss the contradiction here. If our national debt is this terrible crisis, as the Republicans say, why in the world would we be borrowing more money to keep tax cuts for Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos? Why would we be firing half of the Internal Revenue Service so they can't audit things? The IRS will have to give up both civil cases and criminal cases because they don't have any staff. I was told the other day that the budget now on each case for pursuing either civilly or criminally a tax cheat or suspected tax cheat, that the budget for expert witnesses is $1 per case, which means there is no budget for expert witnesses. Don't just grouse. Be a citizen. Think about what you can do. Think about how to support the people who are acting and be empathetic to the fools who Donald tricked.
And that is wisdom from a man who's been in the trenches the whole time. And like other people could be a target. And you have said publicly and courageously, you're not going anywhere.
I wrote a column at DC Report. I'm not leaving. I'm not going to Canada. I'm absolutely eligible to go. One of my children is a dual citizen now, and I meet all the criteria, but I'm not leaving. It's my country. And listen, if we lose this, and we can lose this, it's not guaranteed we're going to get back our democracy. We do not live right now in a democracy. We live under a dictator who is still consolidating power. He has a long way to go to consolidate power. But if we lose this, down that road lie firing squads, whether they're a year from now or they're 3 decades from now. All dictatorships have to execute people. And you know among the very first people they always execute?
Those who with the truth.
No, no, the supporters.
Oh,
They
really?
purge their own ranks. And the reason they do this is to discipline the people around them to be totally subservient. So if you want to get a good feel for this and with a comic relief to it, watch the movie The Death of Stalin. Watch it twice or 3 times. It's very funny. It's about what happened when Stalin died. And everybody knows that if Beria, the head of the secret police, takes over the government, as they all expect, they're all dead,
Right.
even though they were his local core. Sarah Kendzior, the journalist turned expert on authoritarianism. Professor Tim Snyder, now at the University of Toronto, or about to be there. Professor Jason Stanley, who's also going there, have all written eloquently about this. So it's important we win unless you want to live in a dictatorship. And down that road, there will be firing squads. It's just the way those things work. Keep in mind that Donald admires MBS, the de facto head of the Saudi government. And in 2013, so I guess that's 12 years ago now, he had 39 imams, the Muslim equivalent of a pastor or rabbi, 39 imams publicly beheaded. And what was their crime? They prayed for a better government. That's who
Wow.
Donald likes. So,
It,
anyhow, good to talk with you, Patrick.
yeah, that hour just disappeared, and like Bill and June say, David Cay Johnston is a national treasure. Thank you for your time. All the best to you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
All right.